Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
They were building positions in there
if
for
anything
a
happened
fight.
to us, by the time anyone got to us,
I think it was chaos.
the weather was so bad there would be
I used
nobody
to run
left.
with boots full of blood.
And the next thing I hear was alarms,
Chances of
screaming.
survival were very, very slim.
The soldiers didn't want to go into the ambushes, so they'd send the kids in first. And so he was sent in first into an ambush and he got shot in the stomach.
It was very hard for me, very hard for my family. And the plane burst into
Proud of the
flames.
crew, proud of what I've achieved and what I'm
To
doing.
volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
This is the third and final of our 2018 Veterans Panel episodes. I found this panel a very moving experience, and I'm sure you will as well. I'm Alex Lloyd, speaking in Canberra today with three previous guests of Life on the Line. Sharon Bown, welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Alex.
Also here is Dave Stafford Finney. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Alex.
And also returning to the podcast is Don Barnby. Hello, Don.
Go on, mate.
Thank you all for coming back on the podcast. Many of our listeners will have heard your conversations already with Angus Horden, Thomas Kay, and myself before. And if anyone's discovered us more recently, I encourage you to go back and listen to those individual interviews. But I'm pleased to be with you all again today to speak about some wider topics about service, specifically transitioning out of the forces and using your stories to touch on that wider concept around that. So to start, think back to before you joined the forces, even back to when you were kids. First, do you remember what the words soldier, sailor, and so on meant to you? Sharon?
Well, I guess it was a historic definition. It was about ancestors, people that had served in my family long before me, and people that I didn't know. So I had an uncle that served in Vietnam as an infantry soldier, but he had never returned to Tasmania after his service. He remained living on the mainland. So it was almost an abstract definition about another world that didn't really involve me.
Don?
My memories of thinking of army particularly was my uncle who served in the Second World War. And that's because my dad was in the police, so he couldn't join. But my uncle served in the Middle East and New Guinea. He used to tell me some stories and show me some of the stuff he brought back from the Middle East, German gear. And that sort of got me interested, but I was always interested in military type subjects as a kid, playing soldiers. I was always in the cavalry and all that sort of stuff, so that was just the life of the time.
Yeah, I guess similar. It was pretty abstract for me. My father was in the Air Force, and I think through that period there was not a lot happening. So it just seemed to be everyone I was meeting was either there for the adventure or the good work. The idea of Anzacs or soldiers or sailors from major conflicts wasn't really something that I was familiar with, and so I just sort of wanted a job and a bit of fun at the time, to be honest.
So it's a mix of these higher concepts and this legend in our national psyche. And Dave, you felt you had a bit more of an on-the-ground real, this is just the day-to-day lifeline of work to go into. Okay. Now, still thinking back in the past, what did the term veteran mean to you? Do you feel that had any distinction from soldier, army, etc.?
Veteran to me always meant somebody that had served overseas. I don't think I ever thought of a veteran as being just somebody that had served in the military but had not gone overseas. Veteran always had a connotation or the meaning that, he served overseas in an operation.
They'd seen stuff, they'd done stuff.
Yeah, in a war, basically.
Yeah, I would agree with Don. For me, veteran was generally an older man who had been in war overseas. And certainly as I entered the nursing profession, it was to do with REPAT and the Department of Veterans Affairs. It was older men that I was coming into contact with because they were requiring healthcare.
But did either of you separate that concept from family you'd had in the military?
Well, again, all of the people in my family that had served were old men. So that was the stereotype that I guess I was growing up with. It wasn't something that I associated with women or any of the women in my family, but it wasn't until I was in high school when we had Defence Force recruiting come in that I started to see that perhaps there was a place for me in this world, but I still wouldn't have thought of myself as ever becoming a veteran.
And David was literally your old man.
See, I wouldn't have even classed him as a veteran. I think I was pretty young and immature at the time. And again, like the idea of a veteran was someone who served in Vietnam or World War I or World War II. It was a very sort of specific demographic in my mind at the time.
We'll come back to the meaning of that word a bit further in the chat. Before we continue, just for our listeners, let's briefly recap each of your service histories. Don?
Joined the Army when I was 17 for 6 years, served in Vietnam in Special Air Service and discharged in 73 and then joined the police force.
Yeah, I joined the Navy in 98, stayed there for 19 years. I served in Bougainville, East Timor, Timor-Leste, Middle Eastern area of operation and a fair bit of border patrol.
I joined in 99 as a registered nurse, became a nursing officer in the Royal Australian Air Force. I stayed for 16 years. I deployed twice to East Timor, once to Afghanistan, and was seriously injured on operations during my second deployment to East Timor.
So I want to start to head our way towards a conversation about leaving the forces and that whole process and using your stories to guide that conversation, but also looking at the larger issues in the veterans community today from that. So let's talk about how you all left the armed forces. Sharon and Dave, you were both medically discharged.
I had a series of mental health issues, probably leading up to my last, in hindsight, probably the last 8 or 9 years. But it sort of became serious in the last 12 months or so. By the time I was told that I was being medically discharged, I think I'd sort of already come to peace with it. So it was a bit of a journey and a roller coaster on the way out. But the day that came around when I did leave was a pretty good day. Like I probably needed to leave a few years earlier, but I've never disliked or had a problem with defence. I've always loved it. So I was sad about leaving, but it was time for me to go personally.
My story is probably a little different to Dave's in that my medical discharge started 11 years before I left. I was seriously injured in a helicopter crash in East Timor in 2004, where I had a severe spinal fracture, broke my jaw, aviation fuel burns to my neck and shoulders, and eventually developed a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. It was a time in the Australian Defence Force where we didn't have a rehabilitation program, so the assumption was that I would end my career at that point. But I felt that I had lost so much in that incident, and I loved my job as a nursing officer that I fought to stay, and I continued that fight for many years afterwards. So each year with our annual medical assessment, it was a question of whether I'd be able to stay for another year. So when it finally came to the point that I was deemed to be medically unfit to continue, for me, it wasn't a surprise, yet it was the point where I lost the battle. And so it was difficult for me to accept that decision. I questioned whether I could have done more. And I think that's because I had been winning for so long. What did I do wrong in those final 12 months to not be able to win one more time? So leaving was particularly difficult.
But you both had this long build-up, which, but more so for you, Sharon, but there was a sense of inevitability behind it. And Dave, it sounds like you came to the realisation a bit more last minute, but...
I don't think it's inevitability, it was more denial. In my
right,
case.
Okay. The writing was on the wall, you just weren't looking at the wall. Okay. Sharon, this slow build and then you finally reach this point and it's this bittersweet goodbye.
Look, I had a great career and that's the reason I wanted to stay. It was my life. I loved my job and that's why I fought so hard for many years to stay in the forces. And I knew that my spinal fracture with age would degrade and that eventually I would no longer be able to meet the physical requirements of service. But I guess I was always focused on that survival, that not being a victim of my circumstances, that I would prove everybody wrong and stay for my entire career as I had planned. Unfortunately, my injury degraded faster than anyone had expected.
Don, Vietnam SAS, Phantom of the Jungle, Super Trooper. You decided that wasn't enough fun, so you swapped your camos for police blues. Tell me about transitioning into that. What made you go to the cops right after Vietnam?
I initially signed for 6 years, and after Vietnam, in 73, my 6 years was up. But the government at the time disbanded one of the squadrons, or the squadron that I was in, 2 Squadron. And then the Army, as you know, for that long period of time, there was about 15 or something years that there was nothing really happening. I wanted to stay in the Army, and I was offered some good incentives to work with the Yanks and the SEALs and all that sort of stuff. But I couldn't see myself in a peacetime army sort of thing because I'd been living on the adrenaline buzz, and at the end of 6 years I thought I might transition out, get out. And because Dad was in the police force and I'd lived that side of life as a kid, living in police stations over in New South Wales. So I thought, well, I mean, there's no way I was going to end up in David Jones or a bank. That would just bore me to death. So I still had this adrenaline thing and this 10-foot tall and bulletproof sort of mentality. So I joined the police force, and Dad suggested don't join New South Wales, join Canberra, because he came down here during a springboat tour and they had better equipment, better money, and it was a small police force and you didn't get transferred everywhere because we went to about 4 or 5 different schools. So I joined the police force and relived the adrenaline for many, many years, 25 years.
Well, you are now all veterans and you joined with a passion to serve or just looking for a job, but you wanted to put the uniform on and get onto it. I wonder, how much thought had you all given to what would life be like after that adventure in uniform? Was it much of a consideration when joining up?
No, I didn't even think about it because in my case, I traded one uniform for another. But because I joined young at 17, I hadn't really lived any life. I hadn't lived a life. I was a kid. I think I was a kid when I still got out, but I was still a kid. If you join later in life, you've lived a life. You've had a few jobs, whatever. So you've got a perspective on civilian life. And there's a certain cloak of security when you're in a service, whether it be military or paramilitary, semi-military. And you sort of looked after a bit. Police force is the same. I had no idea what to look forward to. I just thought I'd put on the blue uniform and just get on with it, which I did.
Interestingly, I had thought about life after service when I joined, but that faded. So I joined because I wanted to deliver humanitarian aid overseas as a registered nurse.
Because you already were a nurse?
Yes, yeah. And, I was young and naive. I thought I could save the world, one disadvantaged person at a time, and the Air Force would allow me to do that. And I believed that I would go and do that for a while and then go and try something else. I was deployed to East Timor within 12 months of joining. I was there as a perioperative nursing officer, so a theatre nurse, and I loved it. I fell in love with my job, with my career, and it was there that I made the decision that I would stay until retirement, that I would one day be Director Defence Force Nursing, that I would do it my way and fix all of the problems in Air Force Health. So yes, that life after service faded into the background because life after service was going to be old age and retirement.
After your helicopter crash, though, did you still push that to the back of your mind and thought, no, I can stay here for the long haul?
Yeah, obviously at that time, early retirement reared its ugly head, but that gave me an incentive to fight because I wasn't ready for that. I didn't want to end my career. So I was still very much denying that I would have anything other than a long-term career in the Air Force.
Were you thinking about the future much, Dave, when you went to sea?
I think originally, very similar to Sharon, I had a 6-year or a 10-year plan when I first joined, and which is pretty common in the military. You can have a really great job that you love, or the next week you can have a job that is terrible and no one likes. So I did a couple of deployments early on that were the sort of deployments that I think would make anyone want to stay, where you've got purpose and you're doing a job and you're helping people. And it's everything you train for, as opposed to just training or doing a job that sort of you feel like there is no real purpose. So after, 5 or 6 years, I really stopped thinking about the future. Well, stopped thinking about the future, but my future was in defence. I don't think I was ever going to leave. And I remember thinking once, like, what would I do if I got out? And then that was the end of that thought process, like move on, next posting. So it was always a 3 or 5 year plan, depending on postings. And then when I discharged, that was sort of when that planning was drawn out to longer periods of time.
Yours is a bit different, Don, because you just swap uniforms and keep the adrenaline buzz going. But still for you, and applies doubly leaving the army and leaving the police, and for Sharon and Dave, that first little instance of time, those first few days, those first few weeks when you were out, how did you feel? What was going through your head at the time?
I had a few things go through my head at the time. One is I don't have to get a haircut.
You still haven't
since. And then other things, like I'd walk into a room and I don't automatically know my place in the room, which was a really nice feeling actually. Like I don't have rank on my shoulder. No one else has got rank on their shoulder. So everywhere I went, everyone was taken on their own merits. And then slowly it became normal to not be in a uniform because it is a huge shift. I don't think it matters where you go. Look, things change and you've got to let go of, especially after such a long period of time, you've got to let go of your identity and who you are. And with me, luckily, I had enough pillars in my life to sort of sustain my identity with the loss of the uniform.
So it was liberating.
Yeah, I was pretty happy, but also sad. Like I look back at the DVDs and the books and stuff, and like with really fond memories. Like we had a lot of fun.
Sharon?
Yeah, I think there's one word that describes those days and even probably the first 2 years after I left, and that was lost. Because the nature of my spinal injury was that I had lost not just my defence career, but I could no longer nurse. So that future as a registered nurse was also gone. So I really wasn't sure what I was going to do. And the great thing about being in defence was that there was this purpose greater than me. I knew what I was doing each day. I knew why I was there, why I chose to wear the uniform. And when I left, I felt like I had been cast out. One, that you're not good enough for us anymore because you can't meet the physical requirements. But two, that I'd had this incredible career that I loved and that I had lost it. So there was this period of grief. I had a friend, and I think this was very important for me. He said, now is the time for you to discover how much of Sharon is defence and how much of Sharon is still Sharon. And at the time I thought, oh gosh, that's confusing, very philosophical. But as I no longer had to, wear my hair a particular way, put on a uniform, parade at a certain time, I started to get that freedom back again, and I started to re-engage with things I actually enjoyed doing, but hadn't had the time to enjoy whilst I was in uniform. So there was that period of self-discovery again as well.
Have you finished that discovery process, or are you still working out who is Sharon?
I think it's much clearer now where I am and what I want to do with my life, but it's evolving, continuously evolving. It is liberating in that I no longer have someone telling me what the pathway is, what I need to do, what boxes I need to tick to reach the next level. It's all in my hands, and yeah, that's great.
So Don, did you still feel 10 foot tall and bulletproof and all that, swapping uniforms? That was an easy transition, would you say?
Yeah, it was. To me, it was. As I said, I was, I think I was rather an immature 23-year-old. Yeah, it's 23. And I immediately in the police force volunteered for all the adrenaline jobs because I had that buzz. I mean, SAS, it's a boy's own thing. I mean, you do all this stuff that people actually pay money to do, and we get paid to do it. And it was just exciting life. And after Vietnam, we all felt empty because there was no direction for the regiment at that stage. So in the police force, I had a new direction. And I transitioned quite easily. I degreened and started to get a blue brain, as they say. But I did go into all the adrenaline stuff. I was in the rescue squad, I was in special operations and traffic and all those things that you still got a buzz. So, yeah, I was living the life again, and I loved it. And I'd also got married, which calmed me down just a tad.
Did you feel any loss of that structure or clarity of purpose when leaving the police, or did you just feel that sense of relief? I'm out, I get to retire, this is going to be fun, I get more control in my life? Yeah,
well, I was sort of lost, but I was actually embracing, I looked forward to retirement because 25 years in a police service is a long time, very draining. So, no, I actually embraced it, but yeah, I was a little bit lost for direction, but then I immediately worked up at Parliament House and then now at the War Memorial. So you've still got to have some purpose, some direction, some reason for being here.
Particularly today, part of that transition into life after defence is how you are perceived as a veteran and the perception of that word, what that meaning is. So I'm going to come back to the meaning of that word veteran. And I found this in my experience just doing this podcast, and you mentioned it as well, Sharon, that from a civilian point of view today, if I say the word veteran, the average person will think of an older gentleman of World War II, or of a younger gentleman of Vietnam, such as yourself, Don. And I often have to differentiate a veteran of the modern era by saying young veteran or modern veteran. None of you served in the military until the age of retirement. You all discharged with plenty of working life ahead of you. At the time of your discharge, did any of you encounter a disparity of being a veteran, but also being young and not of that older caliber and gravitas?
I'm often met with great delight when I wear my medals. So I think that's when I identify most as a veteran, is when I choose to wear my medals. And I do that a lot in my work at the Australian War Memorial. And I will have members of the public come up to me and say, are they yours? So they don't tell me that I'm wearing them on the wrong side or that I shouldn't be wearing them. They actually sincerely ask me, are they yours? And when I tell them that yes, they are, they're delighted. So they're starting to get this new image of what a veteran looks like. So that I see that as part of my responsibility, is that if I want myself and my colleagues to be seen as veterans and to have the respect and value that all veterans deserve, it's that we must be seen, that we must tell our stories. We can't expect the Australian population to know who we are unless we stand up to be counted.
You're quite proud to be a veteran, Dave, but how much do you link that to your self-identity, do you feel?
I'm not sure, to be honest. Last Anzac Day just gone, I didn't wear anything because I think I was too nervous. I guess there's a feeling of when I was in the uniform, it was okay, and now I'm really conflicted, I guess, internally. I can't explain that. I don't know why, but I guess that's, because it's so fresh. That might change over time, but I don't think of myself anything other than the kid I was when I joined. I don't like associating the word veteran with myself at the moment, whereas when I was in the uniform, I did. And I was proud of it. So I think that maybe it's just a transitional thing, but it's how I feel, or how I don't feel, or how lost I am at the moment, I guess.
What about you, Don? Because you were 23. I mean, you wouldn't have been loud and proud as a Vietnam vet so much back then either.
No, I didn't march for many years after Vietnam. The word veteran is an interesting word. I used to consider myself as a returned serviceman. That was the way I put it. And in those days, the veterans, people I considered veterans, were the First and Second World War guys in Korea. So I was just a returned serviceman, and because of the public feeling at the time, Vietnam, I really forgot about Vietnam. As a part of my life, I was very busy in the police force. I never considered myself a veteran. And because of the anti-feeling when we came back, I didn't march for many years, and probably till the late 70s, early 80s. Yeah, I still considered myself, until younger veterans started to appear in more current conflicts, and I think East Timor was probably the more current one. I still considered myself, we were the younger ones, so we were never, I certainly didn't consider myself a veteran.
But you didn't have a subsequent generation coming along?
No, nothing. There was that gap of 20-odd years. So we were the oldest, we were the youngest, oldest people. And there was a lot of World War II guys there. So they were the veterans. We were the kids, And we weren't loud and proud about it because, Vietnam
had all
the baggage that came with you're a Vietnam veteran. So I just shut up and got on with it. I hardly ever told anybody in the police force about my service. Turned out that a lot of people then found out. They said, well, why didn't you say? Well, why would I? I'm busy doing this stuff now. So that was then, this is now. So.
You were focused on your new life and just getting on with it. How was your first Anzac Day out of service, Sharon?
Probably very similar to Dave's. I didn't know where I fitted anymore. Didn't feel comfortable putting my medals on because I was still very much in that grief stage. I was also the mother of 2 little boys, so I was easily able to say, this is not my place today. My husband is in the army and he's a veteran of a number of campaigns, so it was his day. So certainly taking the uniform off meant that on Anzac Day I could choose to not participate. And interestingly, one of my neighbours here in Canberra is a 98-year-old naval veteran who served in the Second World War. And I asked him this year what he was doing on Anzac Day. And he said, I'm not doing anything, Sharon. I said, oh, okay. He said, I choose to not participate. And I thought, that's wonderful because that is what we have served for. The right, the freedoms, and the safety and security of living in Australia. And he has every right to be able to say, I acknowledge the day, but I choose not to take part.
Did you take part this year?
Yes, well, now my position at the Australian War Memorial means I have an official responsibility. And in some ways that makes it a little bit easier because I still have somebody telling me what my dress standard is, where I should be, what time I need to be there.
But do you have the same mixed feelings anymore, or you've accepted it more and you're more content with your role?
I think the difficulty for me will be when I step away from my position at the memorial and I have the choice to march or not. And I think that's because so many of the people that I have served with are still in uniform and they will march in uniform. So that's something I need to accept, is that can I march with them without the uniform?
Tell me a bit more about the role your family might have played in your transition out of the military, because obviously that's a very confronting, difficult time. You're leaving a job you don't want to be leaving. How integral were they to your support?
They were pivotal. I mean, 2 young boys who needed their mother, so they gave me that sense of purpose. So I was struggling with a professional sense of purpose, an individual sense of purpose of what I was here for. But in terms of family, it was very clear. I had 2 little boys that I had brought into the world who needed me, and I think I needed them even more because they gave me that reason to get out of bed every day and to pursue the future, to plan their future and our future together. My husband remains in the army, and that was good and bad. One, that he understood how difficult it must be to have the uniform taken away because he's very dedicated to his service. So he had that level of empathy, so was incredibly supportive. But on the other hand, it meant that I couldn't completely escape service. We were still very much a defence family. My identity had shifted from being a senior officer in the Air Force to being an army spouse. And that was an interesting journey as well. It gave me a greater sense of experience of all these roles and that I could now tell those stories because I was living them. I was able to speak up for people who were medically discharged, military spouses, mothers who are trying to raise children in a defence force that moves families around the country and deploys their loved ones overseas. So it's all part of that new life.
What about your parents, Don? Because before you joined up, your father thought you were a bit of a waste of space, didn't give you much time of day. And then when he finally found out that SAS wasn't just packing parachutes and worked out what it was just before you went to Vietnam, he was very proud, taking you to the pub, showing you off to all his mates. How was that family relationship once you'd come back and he realised, okay, you've served the country overseas, you've done stuff. Was he proud of you as an individual, or did the Vietnam baggage play into it? Or
No, there was none of the Vietnam baggage with Dad, but I think in a sense, I'm not speaking ill of the dead because he's passed now, but I think he was a bit jealous because he wanted to join in the Second World War and become a fighter pilot. And in fact, 2 of his friends from grammar in Sydney joined, and they were both killed in the Middle East. And that's who I'm named after, actually, 2 of his friends from grammar. But I think he was sort of a bit jealous, and he didn't know what, and you guys probably have the same experience. People that have never been away on a deployment or operation, they don't know how to talk to you. They don't know what questions to ask. So I think Dad just, as a family, they welcomed me back, and then I just couldn't wait to get out and go back to Perth because they had no idea. They felt awkward, I think, asking about anything. Yeah, so I went back to the unit and I was amongst people that my peers. Families are interesting because, as a lot of you will probably agree, they feel awkward. You can tell they're awkward at talking to you about it. What do I ask them? What was it like? That was a big question. So, and how you answer that is entirely up to you. So you just generally smooth over it.
have you had that awkwardness with friends or family, Dave?
Yeah, so I think over the last 20 or so years, before I joined the Navy, I was living in Malaysia for a couple of years. So I've created so much distance between my family and myself. And then when I was married, my wife was also in the Navy, and we were constantly deployed. And then even when we had kids, I was deployed, you know, so I just got so used to having that distance in my life that once I finally got out, that was part of the reason why I wanted to go and spend all this time with my family and try and call them more and talk to them more. And I feel like I'm personally responsible for creating all the distance, and even with my daughter. So it's sort of it's time now to try and bridge that gap and try and rebuild it, but I'm still struggling with that.
Because it's so recent for you, you're still working out the path you need to tread.
Yeah.
Looking at connectivity in the larger veterans community, what do you make of the online opportunity of social media and its role in connecting or even using to support veterans? Is it a useful tool?
I think it is, and it isn't. Quite often I've been involved in pages or sites where people are offering advice, but it sort of sometimes it gets so out of hand, and there's such a big mix of people that you can get advice in there, but it just sort of creates a toxic environment sometimes. So what I've found lately is, I think with the RSL the way it is, we're in a state of transition with veterans care, and everyone's trying to help everyone at the moment, and it just seems to be this huge wash of charity organisations and everything else.
Saturated ESOs, all these micro organisations.
Yeah, and I think it's not long before either one emerges as the one, or a few, or we get back in line with where we were post World War II, or maybe even post Vietnam, where the RSL was the one. I think it's helped me, and it's helped a lot of people. I know a lot of people have contacted me because they don't know the process of them, like what's happening to them, and I've been able to walk people through it. So if not for social media, there would have been a lot of people that didn't know, and myself included, a lot about what's to come, or what's happening, or what are the good days, what are the bad days. But there's also, like it's such a wide area of society. Like it's a cross section of every demographic, and people understand in there, and some people don't understand. So everyone's offering their, like you still get the harden up princess, which is,
is helpful. Yeah, you get the toxic with the constructive.
Yeah.
What about you, Sharon?
Social media.
You can find Sharon at Sharon Bown, author / public speaker on Facebook.
That's right. It's a necessary evil of life these days. Social media is great in that it allows us to educate people more widely than ever before. It also is a form of social connection, which is very important in mental health. It's maintaining that social connection with others. But as Dave says, it can become incredibly toxic, and it can have that very adverse effect where somebody might be feeling particularly depressed about their situation, and that can be fed through some of these sites on social media. So I think it's a great tool when used appropriately, but I think even for myself, I need to be aware when it's time to turn it off, to stop listening to the conversation, and to separate myself from it for a while.
This is a very short answer. I'm not on social media, so.
So you're not following me on Facebook, Don?
No, I'm not on Facebook. Sorry, Sharon.
You're all trained by our nation to be the best soldier, nurse, sailor that you can be. We invest a lot of taxpayer dollars into our servicemen and our servicewomen. And when you're in the system, you either progress through rank or enhance a specialty, you get to wear medals on your chest, or you're in a system that basically should be giving feedback and recognition for your efforts. Then, once you're out, you have to go and enter the workforce and get a job at one point or another, or look at how you can, secure your prospects. Let's talk about prospects upon leaving the military and how you all made those transitions. Don, we've touched on how you swapped your rifle for a policeman's notebook pretty smoothly, but how would you have felt going into a different line of work? Because you joined up at 17. Would you have felt qualified or been able to go into another line of work if you'd had to pursue that?
I think in my case, I'd already planned my life. I didn't have that quandary as to what I was going to do. I think I decided post-Vietnam, and seeing that there was no commitments that the ADF was in post-Vietnam for quite a while, my mind was already made up. So the transition and journey into the police force was just, that was what's going to happen. That's how it happened. And I was very lucky. I did what I had already pre-planned. So there was the only transition I really had to make was I had to think in a totally different way, because in the military you have rules of contact and all that sort of stuff, and in the police force they're totally different. So I had to, as I said, degreen my brain and think about...
And blew it up.
And think about being a police officer and what that involves. So that was a bit difficult. And just on that, what they used to get me to do, it was much later in my service. I used to go down to the police college and actually talk to guys that had come out of the military into the police force and get them to transition their thinking, because it's a totally different mindset. Being in the military, in particular, I was talking to mainly army guys and ex-regiment actually. So I had to say, look, you have to put that in a box and then rethink. And a lot of guys didn't make it. They lasted 2 or 3 years, couldn't handle the transition, and 2 of them actually went back to the regiment because they couldn't handle that different way of approaching a situation.
But you had to do that yourself. The army didn't set you up for, this is how you can move on and look to the future. Once you're out, okay, done.
There was no career advice in those days. Yeah, your time was up. You signed on the dotted line, gone. There was nothing, no help.
Before we talk about what you're doing today, Sharon, did you feel you had any guidance or direction, or you just had to work it out for yourself?
Because I was medically discharged, there was certainly a transition program in place, but the day that I left, none of those answers had been given. And I think one of the difficulties within the Defence Force, as much as they're trying to assist with that transition process, is you're asking people who've never been through it to assist those that are going through it, which is difficult. If we look at our service chiefs and our CDF, very successful men who've had a career in defence, so they've never had to face losing their job. So asking them to provide guidance and leadership in this area is certainly very challenging. And that's where I see my responsibility in that, well, I've been through it. What can I do to assist others to survive this transition process? I don't expect to ask those that haven't experienced it to have the answers.
Well, you're very much doing that today. You are so active in the veteran space. You're using your story as a platform to inspire and guide others. You're an author, of course, mentioned your work at the War Memorial. You're a public speaker, using all your experience and skills. So you find that quite rewarding, and you're giving back to, a younger version of yourself who would have liked to receive such guidance.
Yes, absolutely. I think we still have a long way to go. I think those that join the Australian Defence Force set themselves apart from the rest of the Australian population. They're prepared to put their life on the line to defend our way of life, and they are exceptionally well trained. They have unique experiences and skills. I would love all of them to see that defence doesn't necessarily have to be a career, but it's an important chapter in their lives. And I would love for the rest of the Australian population, particularly employers, to see that as well. That when a veteran of the Australian Defence Force applies for a job, that here is a unique opportunity to access a resource, a person who has a unique set of qualities, skills and experience that you cannot get anywhere else. And we are struggling to do that at the moment. We are finding that veterans are having great difficulty in getting employment outside of defence. And I'm aware of a current trend where particularly young men are denying that they ever served because they see it as being something that will go against them in a job application. And I think that's a great tragedy, because what they have done for their country gives them, as I said, a unique set of skills and experience that employers should be looking for.
And that service to the country, a civilian employer might look at that on the CV and not understand it, not know exactly what skills that person's bringing. You'll have to be searching for work at some point, Dave, when you're done trekking around the country. Is that an intimidating prospect in that you have to translate your career into civilian speak? I know you can list all the, huge array of skills you had being a technician, if that's a line you want to go down. But is that something that worries you?
It does slightly. When you say they've trained you up, I feel like for years, you're a recruit, and then you start your trade training, and then you go to sea, and you just feel like a trainee, like you're not actually giving back. And then at one point you realise that you are, and then that builds up, and then you've got years and years of giving back, and you're sort of feeling like you're breaking even or more of part of the team. But I think there's no job that's going to match up to that, because I've got 20 years of trade experience, which probably equates to about 4 or 5 years outside. I've also got firefighting experience and, a whole list of other things, or weapons experience. I know what it's like to be in a peace talk, or, how to navigate a series of problems that I wouldn't navigate in any other job. There's not one job that I think you can apply all of those skills to. So you've got to sort of pick where your niche was and go down that line, and then how much experience do you have, or do you even have anything on paper that says that? So I think I changed my way of thinking probably around the 10-year mark, where I really wanted to start looking after people. A couple of years after that, I started volunteering with Camp Quality and Men's Link in Canberra, which is like a Big Brother organisation. And that was the sort of things that really made me feel worthwhile. And so as much as I can't take that and apply it into the workforce, I think it's at least a way for me to move forward and be, happy within myself with what I'm doing.
Well, I think all you guys shouldn't have that level of concern in an idealistic world, because you've just listed an incredible versatile range of skills. There's all the technical stuff, and then there's this problem solving, there's this ability to both lead and be led, work in teams, work independently, work in incredibly high pressure scenarios. It's the kind of stuff the average civilian doesn't get to do. And to see that overlooked in a modern era through worried about, bringing on a soldier, what does that mean, and that kind of thing. There's some misconceptions out there about the word veteran today, and that returned servicemen and servicewomen might be coming back and bringing a bag of problems with them. Would that be a fair statement, that there are some of those misguided perceptions out there?
Certainly, then I think the overwhelming narrative in the media is a negative one. They do tend to concentrate on those that are really struggling post-service or have been mistreated in service. But there are far many more inspiring stories of what veterans go on to do. I mean, many veterans go on to set up their own businesses. If they can't be employed by someone else, they're incredible entrepreneurs who will just set out to, seek their purpose and achieve what they want to. I mean, Glenn Ferrato of Ironside Recruiting is a classic example. Saw a gap in the veteran employment and recruiting space, and he filled that gap. So balance of life beyond service. Some of it is incredibly tough, but even those that really struggle post-service go on to have incredible careers and incredible lives beyond service. Telling those stories and displaying, those positive examples means that those who are in that really difficult post-transition space or post-service space can see the light at the end of the tunnel. Or they can seek out a mentor or someone to say, well, hey, you did it. How on earth did you get through this time?
Let's talk about media perceptions. And one of the things I've come across doing this podcast is that difficulty or trauma from service is perfectly normal. I mean, look at the three of you. We have a Vietnam-era Special Forces trooper and federal policeman who's been to East Timor, among other places, with them. A nurse and officer with the Royal Australian Air Force who served in Timor, Bali and Afghanistan and survived a helicopter crash. And a marine technician who's been to Timor, Bougainville and the Gulf. 12 operational deployments, visiting 19 countries between 2 ships and 3 boats, tallying 43 ports and all those various adventures that entails.
Each one has its own story.
I'm sure we could do a whole series on each port. Sharon and Dave, you two received a PTSD diagnosis during your service. And Don, you were more impacted by the atrocities in Timor than Vietnam, which I think says a whole lot about Timor. Let's chat about the perception of PTSD. In our individual conversations with you, we've talked about the experiences you had and how you overcame it. So I want to talk more widely about the PTSD label today and how it's used in the media and therefore how that's colouring public perception.
I spent a bit of time in hospital last year in a PTSD ward. It's a real mixed feeling because I feel ashamed that I'm getting the help and I have the label as some of the other people that have been through so much more or, done things that I couldn't imagine doing. So it was a real, I guess for me, it was a feeling of weakness. Not that I would ever think that of anyone else, but when I look at other people that have done much more than me and they're okay, I look at that as resilience. So I can't work out what it is that I've got. But then I also feel, I hear it in songs now. They talk about PTSD. I hear it, I see it. And so sometimes I feel like it's being used as a term that's a real term. And then other times I feel like it's just something that gets thrown around. So I'm really confused I don't like telling people I have PTSD. I'm not sure what that means to other people because everyone's got their own perception of it.
Well, when you first chose to speak with us, what prompted you to come out of your comfort zone and share that story?
I think I like to talk. I've been a sailor for most of my life.
And we put a microphone in front of your face, so...
That's gold.
No, look, I started writing about my experiences and it seemed to have a bit of a positive feedback. And then, a lot of people contacted me and a few of my friends that have been in very similar situations where they're walking around their houses looking for things to commit suicide with, or they'll tell me this or their wives will tell me this. And then quite often people say, thanks for talking when we can't, or... So it pushed me in the direction to keep talking a little bit. And I feel like I'm at a point in my life where I'm not that ashamed to be who I am anymore. I still have my reservations and I don't want to burst out screaming anything, but...
Just the microphone I've put in front of you.
Yeah. I look at other people, especially in the hospital, you really see a raw side of it that I think you can hide if you're out in the streets or at home or at work, but you couldn't hide it in there, and it was really raw and really real for me to witness all that, and it made me feel like a part of a community as well. We developed some pretty good friendships in there. It was much like posting into a mess. Everyone was either police, first responders or military. Everyone knew how to act around each other. We set up our own social committee. It was real,
it was structured.
It was to get away from the military, but we just made it military again straight away.
Just fell into routine habits. Yeah. I can't take ownership of these words because I'm a civilian, so I can't relate to this on that personal level. But I have had veterans talk to me about veterans codifying their service, codifying their trauma, and that I was in this particular hellish gunfight that's worse than what you must have been through, or well, I survived this, which is worse than what you survived. I don't think you a right to rank your service and your trauma or whatever caused your PTSD to go, well, this person went through that, which sounds worse than what I did, and they're okay. You can't compare yourself. Every person's experience and their background shapes how they perceive events, how they react to it. Trauma is unique, and none of it is wrong. It is trauma. And you go through that at your own pace, and you can't hold yourself at a pedestal compared to other people.
I know you say you can't, but I broke my leg on a jet ski, and when I went to the hospital in Cairns, the guy next to me had all his ribs broken by a crocodile. You know, I wanted to walk out of that hospital because I didn't feel like I deserved to be next to him.
Are you finding a way to try and justify it to yourself, or you're still walking that?
I'm walking that line. Look, I'm okay when there's a lot of work that I've done and a lot of work I've got to do, and I think that's going to be an ongoing road. And either I'll fix it and correct it, or I'll learn to live with it. You know, so there's a light at the end of the tunnel, no matter what direction that ends up being.
Don, you'll know wide range of people, whether it's from the jungle or from the roads around Canberra. What's your take on perceptions of PTSD, how it's portrayed, and how people who have it have to deal with it when there's this potentially negative spotlight on it?
I think the general perception about PTSD from the public perspective is quite wrong, because they all, as soon as they hear PTSD, all the perceptions are wrong. They're negative perceptions, whereas what they should be, the stories that should be out there are people that have been diagnosed with PTSD for whatever reason and that have overcome it and, you know, owned it and then moved on. The victory stories as opposed to PTSD/suicide. That's the perception that a lot of the members of the public, and even probably ex-servicemen, and in my case, police, that a lot of police have PTSD. But it's always the negative perception, you know, that you've got PTSD, so boy, you've got a big problem and it ain't going to get any better. So, you know, we sort of feel sorry for you.
You're a drain on society. What's the point?
Yeah, it's like, and instead of that, they should be talking about the uplifting stories, the positive ones, the people that have really overcome incredible things and then moved on and then done amazing things with that diagnosis. It's not a death sentence and you can overcome it. We've all been diagnosed with PTSD, but we've all handled it in our own personal way. In my case, it wasn't Vietnam, it was more police service. And then Timor was just that was the straw. Yeah, I was too busy to even think about PTSD. And having said that, it wasn't even a term that was bandied around in the 70s and 80s. It wasn't even talked about. I mean, you know.
Now it's a catchphrase and a hashtag.
Yeah, now it's a little bit like hero. I think it's overused in some ways. I mean, a lot of people have PTSD for lots of reasons, not just veterans. But I think it's a little bit cliched, and that also gives it a bad bum rap, I think. Yes, it is a condition, but it can be overcome.
We need to be, as a society, I think, more constructive and supportive of our veterans and not shy away from a medical label that's been so overused and saturated that it's just geared so many negative connotations, it's almost lost its actual substantive meaning. I mean, Sharon, you had a PTSD diagnosis, and as Don somewhat describes, you've swung around and you're a role model for people.
Thank you, Alex. I mean, I can talk about PTSD from two different perspectives. One being a registered nurse who's cared for veterans and recently completed my Bachelor of Psychology, so I can talk about it very clinically. But as a person, as an individual, it was a diagnosis that I fought against. It was a label that I didn't want, and it's a label I still struggle with because of the stigma that surrounds it. The most recent survey of mental health literacy in Australia, and when I say mental health literacy, that means what do people understand about this particular condition, shows that our mental health literacy around PTSD is very low. Australians can identify the signs and symptoms of anxiety and depression and the possible treatments and outcomes because we've had great campaigns like Beyond Blue that have educated us about that. So the mental health literacy for depression and anxiety is very good. But for PTSD, there are still a lot of misconceptions around how somebody with PTSD might present. And generally, they're very negative, that they will be angry, that they will be violent, that they will be suicidal. So all these very negative behaviours that people would associate with PTSD. And so then if that's the underlying belief about this condition, then would you allow your children to spend time with someone with PTSD? Would you employ somebody with PTSD? So we need to really work on increasing the mental health literacy around PTSD. And that has helped me in some ways to accept my diagnosis. I mean, I share the same concerns that Dave does, is that why was I so weak? Why was I not resilient enough to fight against this particular condition? And I still struggle with that sometimes. And it also means that I'm witness to conversations about PTSD when people don't know that I have the diagnosis. And they're interesting. But that, again, that tells me that our health literacy around that is not very good, that people don't really know what they're talking about. But also, when I was first diagnosed with PTSD, I was quite clearly told that I would never recover, that this was a lifetime condition from which I would never recover. That's a death sentence. People can recover from PTSD. We are very busy doing research and trying to understand this condition so that we can not just treat people who are diagnosed with it, but try and prevent people from ever experiencing. So there are very positive stories around PTSD. And again, that's why I want to demonstrate to people who have the diagnosis that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There is life with PTSD and there is life beyond PTSD. And I'm a very firm believer in that only those that have fallen down and stood up again have that unique strength and resilience to be able to live a fully informed and complete life.
I think you're all much more resilient than any of you would describe yourselves as the civilian bystander here in the conversation. And that actually makes a good point as well, that I can imagine when you were facing that diagnosis, of course, being a nurse, you will have seen this kind of thing in the field. So when you're starting to receive that diagnosis, you have clinical understanding of what that means and you're wanting to back away from that. No, I don't want to be a part of that.
Well, clinically, we still don't know enough about it. And so that increases the stigma. So for a very long time, if we look at the history of PTSD, psychiatrists themselves did not want it put into their diagnostic manual. It was seen as an anxiety condition rather than a trauma condition. So there's still a lot of clinical misunderstanding and poor literacy around PTSD. So if the clinicians are struggling with it, how do we expect the general population to understand it? But as I said, the positive aspect of that is it's spurring us on to learn more, to do more. I mean, the greatest population of undiagnosed PTSD sufferers, if you like, in Australia would be those who have suffered childhood sexual abuse. It's a significant lifetime trauma and one which naturally could progress to PTSD, but we tend to focus on veterans or frontline services being those that suffer with PTSD, but it's a much larger population than that. And as we come to understand it, and as we come to understand the changes, the physical changes in the brain for people with PTSD, I think we'll get a greater acceptance and understanding.
Need to understand better the science, then
Yes.
how to treat it, and then how to communicate it.
Yes, but I think the important message for me is that, as I said, there is life with PTSD and there is life beyond PTSD. It is not a death sentence.
Sharon, Dave, and Don, it's always a pleasure, and I'm glad we got you three back on the podcast to speak about these topics. Your insight is invaluable, and I hope it does make a difference to anyone listening. Thank you again for your service and for your time.
Cheers.
Thanks,
Absolute
Alex.
pleasure.
That was my panel talk with Sharon Bown, Dave Stafford Finney, and Don Barnby. You can help us get this conversation out there and in the ears of a veteran or their family that need to hear these stories. Please spread the word. Post the link to the episode on your social media and recommend the podcast to your friends. You can help us reach even more people by going to iTunes and leaving us a 5-star rating and review. And if you missed them, check out the other 2 panel episodes over the last couple of weeks. Returning home was Angus Horden's conversation with recent veterans Garth Callender, Michael Wright, and Glenn Kolomitz. The Vietnam War panel had Angus speak with 4 veterans of that conflict: Sandy McGregor, David Buckwalter, David Leaf, and Ron Aitken. You can hear my one-on-one conversation with Sharon way back at the start of Season 1 last year. Number 2, Sharon Bown. Angus Horden spoke with Dave to kick off Season 2 this year, in number 17, Dave Stafford Finney. And Don shared his story with Thomas Kay across a 2-part episode, so listen to both number 18 Don Barnby Volume 1 and Volume 2. This is our last panel episode for the year. I hope you enjoyed this short series of episodes. To get more episodes of Life on the Line in the future, make sure you're subscribed in your podcast app. We'll be back in mid-November. Email us at podcast@lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Visit our website www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Follow us on Twitter at LOTLpod. And follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook at Life on the Line Podcast.
Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions.
Artwork by Big Cat Design, music by Dan Van Werkhoven.
Thank you for listening, and lest we forget.